On the Upper Current River, really Round Spring encompasses everything. Not only do you have the campground, you also have Round Spring itself, which produces 26 million gallons a day that empties into the Upper Current River. You also have the Round Spring Cave, which is the only cave throughout ONSR that is open for public visitation. No other park system across the U.S. has as many caves and springs within one single park. With that being said, all of the caves are closed for access except for the one cave, Round Spring. We have left it open for educational opportunities simply because it has provided an invaluable opportunity for folks to understand not only the cave and karst features themselves, but also the wildlife that reside within it.
My role here at the National Park Service is cave guide. Basically, I've been doing that for 6 years here. I've probably been in the cave about 400 times. So I know the cave pretty well, and I'm pretty sure we won't get lost while we're in the cave. This cave is about a mile long, and it's beautifully decorated. And I like to tell people it's the best kept secret in the Ozarks because our tours here are very small, and so we don't advertise much, just in park literature and things like that. So a lot of people do not know about this, but a lot of people, their first experience with this cave is, wow. Bats are important to our ecosystem, very, very important. They help us control insects. They'll eat their weight in insects on a given evening, most of them mosquitoes. Of course, we know mosquitoes are vectors for disease, and the fact that millions of our bats are gone means that there are billions of mosquitoes out there that would have normally been eaten by bats. Here at our park, once you walk in our cave does have white nose syndrome in it. We know it, we've tested for it. When we come out, we do a decontamination. So it's extremely important that we protect the remaining populations of bats so they can actually return to their normal numbers. The good news is that this disease came ashore on the East Coast. It was brought here by a single caver that was in a French cave that didn't know white nose disease existed because their bats were immune to it. So what we're hoping is that our bats will become immune to these if we have enough surviving individuals that we can actually rebuild the bat population. People always ask, were there Native Americans in this cave? No, there was not. Even though we have a 5,000-year history of Native Americans at the spring, we have no evidence that they ever entered this cave whatsoever. In 1863, the first people to enter this cave, or so we believe, were Union soldiers that were camped out down here at the spring. And whether they were told about this cave or they found it themselves, we have no idea. But one of them was a medical doctor, and he wrote home about this cave, and he described it perfectly. He described its location, he described this natural arch that we see behind me here, and then he went inside the cave with 4 other soldiers, and he gave us a perfect description of the cave. He guesstimated that the cave was a mile long. It is exactly a mile long. One thing he did mention was that when he got inside the cave about 100 feet, they had to get down on their bellies and crawl into the cave. And it was about a 100-foot crawl to get inside this cave. And that's probably why Native Americans never entered this cave. They didn't have the technology. The soldiers had candles and oil lanterns with them, so they were able to get inside the cave where the Native Americans couldn't. Once they got inside the cave, they saw many beautiful wonders that they wrote home about. And those natural wonders are still there for us to see. And in very natural condition. And probably the reason for that, it was so hard to get into this cave. Only a few people actually entered this cave until 1932. In 1932, a local family decided to commercialize this cave because in 1925, their neighbor became one of Missouri's first state parks, Round Spring State Park. So he decided to commercialize the cave, but getting into it was very difficult. So they actually blasted out the entranceway so the entryway is no longer a foot or two high, but 5 feet high. So you do have to bend over, be able to bend over for about 50 to 75 feet to get into the main cave. Once you get into the main cave, wow, it's all there. Are you guys ready? Let's go explore a cave. Watch your heads as you go through here. Well, when the soldiers came through here, the cave was probably about 3 foot high. And if you look really close at the ceiling, you can see where they blasted or chipped away rock because it's smoother and it's fresher. The weathered rock looks totally different that we see on the walls and things like that. Normally, during cave tour season, there's water running down through here. This passageway actually drains the right-hand passage. So you can have quite a bit of water moving through here, usually, but it's totally dry right this minute. Again, you can see places where they actually chipped rock away in here to widen the passage a little bit to make it easier for visitors to get into the cave. We have arrived at the T-junction. For your information, we're about halfway through the main trunk passage, which we're in, which is huge. We have a right-hand passage going off here and a left-hand passage. We're going to go down the left-hand passage to begin with. And most of the really beautiful stuff that we'll see inside the cave is down the left-hand passage. This cave, when we look at the size of this passageway right here, tells us that this was once part of a very large spring system, much larger than it is today. This cave is actually closed on each end by collapses. So at one time, a tremendous amount of water moved through this passageway to actually develop it and make it as large as it is today. So all caves start out as springs, and they usually develop underneath the water table, way below, say, river level was outside. What happens is you have slightly acidic water that forms up along a bedding plane or a vertical crack in the rock, and it actually slowly dissolves out that rock, making basically a oval-shaped cave full of water. But as the current river actually erodes down through this rock layer that we are standing in, water starts to begin to flow through it, and it forms a spring. As the current river continues to erode outside this cave and it gets below the floor level of this cave, it actually drains it out, and it switches from being a spring to a cave at that point in time. So when we look, as we travel through this cave, you'll see this huge passageway. You can just imagine the amount of water that moved through this cave at one time. And we'll talk more about that farther back in the cave. Okay, we have arrived at the theater room. This is our first example of speleothems, also called cave formations. And as you can see, this is a very large grouping. And how these things form inside of caves is basically up on the surface, it rains. As that water seeps through the organic layer, it picks up a little carbon dioxide, CO2. If you remember from high school chemistry class, you mix those two things together, you get a slight acid called carbonic acid. And we're all very familiar with carbonic acid because it's what's in our Cokes and Pepsis. It's just carbonated water. As it comes down through the layers, it actually dissolves away just a little bit of calcite. And when it comes into this air-filled room, it actually outgasses a little of that CO2, and it leaves a microscopic amount of mineral behind. So these formations, these massive formations that we see in this room, were actually made one drip of water at a time. So you can just imagine how long it took and how many droplets of water it took. Now, of course, when the formation forms on the ceiling and comes down, we call it a stalactite. If it comes from the floor up, it is a stalagmite. Many times these things are right under one another, and they'll grow together and actually form a column. Our column is broken here because this formation group got so heavy, it collapsed the clay underneath it and actually split and dropped about 6 inches. There's one other type of formation I want to bring your attention to, because this cave is famous for its draperies. And farther back in the cave, we're going to see draperies. A drapery is a type of stalactite, and basically it forms when water runs down the leading edge, and it makes a very convoluted drape that looks just like a drape in your living room. Some of these can be so thin that you can shine a flashlight through, and we'll see more of these farther back in the cave. The only other thing I'll point out about this room is, even though it is still active some, when I shine lights up on top of the room up here, I see a few very small formations that are actually reflecting light. That means there's a lot of water on them. Most of the formations are very dull in this room. That's because there's no water dripping in this room. For hundreds of thousands of years, water dripped in this room, but it no longer drips. The room is primarily dormant right now as I shine my light around. What happened? Somewhere between the surface and down here, something changed. Maybe a sinkhole filled in up above us, maybe a cave passage actually collapsed, and the water no longer drips here. That doesn't mean really anything. In the end, something could change again, and this room could become very active and start growing again at some point in time. Throughout the cave, as we go through the cave, we continue to warn you about touching formations inside the cave. And I have a perfect example of what happens to a formation if you touch it here. Back in the 1930s, when this cave was first commercialized, the owners of the cave built their path down right across here, right past this beautiful little formation. And even though he warned people also, they already knew back then that touching formations could damage a formation, because we have oils on our skin. And these formations are totally dependent on water actually sticking to them and laying down fresh mineral. If we touch a formation, we put oil on it. And we all know that oil and water does not mix. So as the tour guide went walking off with 30 people behind him, even though they had been warned not to touch this formation, I can see where they touched this formation as they went by. The reason I can tell that is there's no water sticking to this side of the formation. It's totally dormant. There's no water, no fresh calcite being laid down here. However, if we come around to the back of this formation where nobody touched it, we can actually see fresh calcite being laid down on this formation. But the touch went from small kids all the way up to adults, basically. And as they walked by, they touched it and therefore damaged this formation. Some people ask us, why don't we wash that oil off? Well, that would require detergents, and that might even further damage the formation. So we just have to wait for it to wear off. If this was outside in the sunshine where the sun was shining directly on that, it would break down these oils in a matter of days. Down here in the cave, that oil could be there 1,000 years from now. So that's why we ask you, please don't touch formations in this cave or any cave. Okay, we have arrived at Bat Hill. The interesting thing that we have here is this huge pile of bat guano. For the kids, bat poop. Even though we have no bats in the cave today, or very few bats in the cave, at one time in the past we had huge quantities of bat in here, and this pile of bat guano is proof that they were once here. We have cored this from the top to the bottom and actually carbon dated this pile. The bats first came here 8,000 years ago, toward the end of the last ice age, basically. It had warmed up outside enough for them to actually migrate back into this area. And they chose this spot in the cave because it's perfect for a colony of maternity bats, probably gray bats, since they roost in great quantities. Up above us is a big dry dome with no dripping water. So the mother bats like to hang up there and actually raise their babies there. They like to have water nearby, and we hear the spring running right behind us here. So a perfect place for bats to actually raise their babies. But this pile told us that they came in 8,000 years ago, and it told us they left 700 years ago. And we don't know exactly why they left the cave, but they did leave the cave at that time period. Also, we did another study in the early 2000s where we checked this pile for pollen. And bats are pollinators, as are the insects that they eat. So it stands to reason that basically pollen would be in here. And what the pollen told us was what was going on outside the cave, what was growing out there and what was living on the surface outside. And we got a real good read on how our forest outside actually evolved from the Ice Age into the forest that it is today. And all that from just a pile of bat poop. It's amazing. We have a spring that's running through the cave right through here, and the water looks crystal clear and looks like it's safe to drink. However, it is not. It doesn't matter which one of the springs you might be at, the crystal clear water coming up out of the ground, a lot of people think that it's safe to drink. And I would recommend that you don't drink the water. The reason for this is some of this water could be coming up from a deeper aquifer and it could be safe to drink, but we don't know for sure where this water comes from. We have a surface component also. We have sinkholes and sinking creeks above us up here, and water is directly running into this aquifer. So when we see this water, even though it looks crystal clear and safe to drink, it is not. For instance, in our little spring right here, if you're outside on the creek, this water is running out as a little spring in a small 8-foot cave. And you might look at it and think it's safe to drink. However, if we follow our source of water up the stream right through here, we come to a huge pile of bat guano that is eroding into the stream. So all this black stuff that we've been seeing in the stream all the way down is actually bat guano. So if you were drinking out of that spring, you were drinking bat guano. So if you don't know where the water is coming from, don't drink the water. This is the tobacco barn. I've been in a lot of caves, but I've not ever seen a room quite like this one. We're right on the edge of it. We're going to actually hike up this pathway right here, come up behind this huge stalagmite right here. We'll be looking down at it, and we'll be in one of the most beautifully decorated rooms that I've ever seen. It's called the tobacco barn because of these brown draperies that we see that ring this entire room. It looks like tobacco drying in the barns back in Kentucky. Some of these formations are huge. There's a stalagmite back here that's 40 feet high. So if you go back to soda straws and realize that they grow an inch every 100 years, how long does it take a formation to grow 40 feet? Okay. Beautiful formations in this room. You might notice that there are 3 basic colors in the formations that we have in this room. And what determines the color of the formations is the mineral that is in the water that is actually dripping on it. We see white formations in here, which are made by pure calcite, basically, calcium carbonate. The orange, the burnt orange formations that we have in this room is made of the same thing, calcite, but mixed with some iron oxide, which is also prevalent in this rock layer that we've been walking through. The black and the gray formations that we see in this room get their color from manganese. Manganese is often found in mineral deposits alongside iron. So these are the 3 basic colors that we'll see all through the cave. If you're out west in other caves, there might be other minerals in those caves that actually give you some different colors. But here in this part of Missouri, these are the 3 basic colors that we see in all of our formations. This formation is called the ice cream sundae for obvious reasons. It's pure white, pure calcium carbonate. Basically, it is a flow stone, and flow stones are actually built by sheets of water, not individual droplets, and they're very, very fast growing. This retaining wall that we see right here was built by the original owners, and even though that was probably 75, 80 years ago, we already see flowstone actually running up against the side of this retaining wall. The interesting thing about flowstones, if anything happens to fall on it, it gets preserved fairly quickly. In another cave that I've been in, there is actually a bat carcass that's covered up by the calcite already. Supposedly in here there's supposed to be a couple mosquitoes, but I have not seen them exactly. But this is another type of formation that we haven't talked about earlier. As we go past this formation, I want you to look over here and see this little pool of water. There's another type of formation, and this is the only place where this formation I have ever seen. Is called cave pearls, and they actually form like real pearls. The calcite will actually form around a grain of sand, and sometimes they are loose, and you can just pluck them out of there. So, which we do not do. But basically, these are cave pearls. As you walk by, take a look at them. When we first purchased this cave and we came up through here, of course our biologists were very interested when they found this high dry passageway here. In Missouri caves, we often find bear beds inside of caves. And, but by just looking at these and the amount of silt and stuff like that in the bear beds, they realized these were very old bear beds. And then they got really lucky. They found a bone in this one, and they actually excavated out a small female cave bear. Well, cave bears went extinct in the state of Missouri 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So that kind of showed us how old these bear beds were. So back 8,000 years ago, cave bears were probably the apex predator on the surface outside. A good-sized cave bear, male cave bear, standing on its hind feet, its nose would touch a basketball goal. Make a grizzly bear look like a little cub, basically. So they were probably apex predators, but Missouri was a land of giants back then. We had mammoths, we had mastodons, we had giant ground sloths, we had saber-toothed tigers, dire wolves, all running around on the surface. But all those animals I just mentioned went extinct at almost the same time. Now, the Ice Age was ending, the temperatures were warming up there, the surface was going from tundra to grasslands to forest over a very quick period of time. So some scientists think that all these animals went extinct because of the habitat change. But also there was another predator that had showed up on the surface that was even badder than what the cave bear was. It was us, it was human beings. By 10,000 years ago, we actually had larger populations of human beings showing up on the surface, and they were here. They were called the Clovis people. Their culture was first recognized in Clovis, New Mexico, and we often thought that it was just a Western culture. We found a Clovis point at Alice Springs. So those people were here, and they were actually hunting the big animals. So did they contribute to the extinction of these animals? Probably. Habitat lost, the arrival of human beings probably ended the career of all of those large mammals. We call it a large mammal extinction. But the other thing that was really interesting about this, these were very large bears. So did they come in the way we did? We know that the entrance we came into was only a foot or two high. There's no way a 1,200-pound bear could have gotten into this cave from the way we came in. Also, we'd never find bear beds this far back in the cave. We usually find them fairly close to an entrance. So that kind of tells us that these bears must have come from someplace else. Well, we have more evidence farther back in the cave back here of bears entering from this direction. So 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, there's a good probability that we actually had an entrance open back here that the bears came in on. And when we get back here to the ballroom, I'll show you some of the evidence that we have that the bears may have come from that direction. This room is called the ballroom. Ballrooms were very, very common back in the day of commercial caves here in the state of Missouri. We used to have probably over 100 commercial caves at one time. We only have a few left. But ballrooms were kind of traditional in this area of the state, because when the early settlers first started coming up the Current and Jacks Fork River, they would go inside the caves they would find, and usually not very far inside, they would find a massive room like this. And they would actually had a use for those rooms. Remember, back then there was no air conditioning, no central heating. This was 58 degrees here inside the cave. So you had the local people actually using these things for social events. Might have church services in here, might have square dances in here, may have lodge meetings in here. Of course, we know during the Civil War, guerrillas hid in caves a lot. This room, and the reason a lot of these rooms are so large, is we have a sandstone cap on top of this cave, and sandstone is pretty well impervious to water. Water cannot get through it to form formations, so we don't see very many formations on top of one of these roofs. But it allows for a wide expanse for the passageway under it to elongate and actually make a big room. Being sandstone, you might expect to find some ripple marks in it. We see some ripple marks up here in the ceiling. This is recording a beach, probably on the Gulf of Mexico about 500 million years ago when this layer of rock was laid down. So back at the bear beds, I was telling you that there was evidence farther back in the cave that told us that the bears actually came from this direction in the cave, other than the direction we came in the cave. When we find bear beds in caves, it's not unusual for us to find bear scratches on the walls. And why we think bears do this is they actually have scent glands in their paws. And this cave is totally dark. They couldn't see any better than we could in the total darkness here. So what they would do is they would scent a trail into the cave. Probably by just walking along the floor, they were leaving a scent. But they would also scratch the walls in case something happened to that scent. This is a cave bear. If you Google cave bears and you look at the paw, they had humongous claws. They could rip just about anything open, and they were a big bear. So you can see that this bear up here was quite large when he stood here. This one maybe a little bit smaller, but the size of the claw marks here tells me that both of these were fairly large bears. So what they were doing was actually marking a trail into the cave. So after they hibernated for 6 months, they would wake up and they would smell their way back out of the cave. So since we didn't see very many bear scratches on that end of the cave, and we see bunches of them on this end of the cave, the bears probably came from this direction. And there was probably another entrance into this cave 8,000 years ago that's since closed up. But we have one other piece of evidence that I want to show you. We have a bear print, one of the best prints I've ever seen in any cave anywhere of a cave bear. And it's over here. We'll walk over here and take a look at it. A big bear made this, but it is so complete. I've never seen one so complete. You can see these horrendous claws I was telling you about. Here's the soft pad right here. So about 10,000 years ago, a bear leaned into this wall and put its print in the mud here. Now we have calcite dripping here, and this could be solid, or it could still be totally soft from the day it was actually put here. There are several other prints here. You can see a couple up here that are partials, but this is a complete print. We are really thankful for the previous owners of this cave to preserve this so that we can actually see it. This is the waterfall. This comes directly off the surface down through a sinkhole. And so when we say we don't know where the water's coming from, this is what we mean. This is a very interesting place, geologically speaking, because we are standing basically at an area where 3 different rock stratas. We have the Gasconade above us up here. We have the Gunter Sandstone right here, and this is the Eminence Dolomite below it. So when I have a geologist along on a tour, he sees this, they get almost teary-eyed because they don't get to see 3 rock strata this easily defined, hardly on the surface at all. This is a flowstone like the ice cream sundae we saw earlier. This is probably the biggest formation by mass that we have inside the cave. We call it the chocolate factory. The passageway is about 6 inches high. Nobody's ever been up it. The water obviously has a lot of iron oxide in it. That's where you were getting the deep brown color. Lights out is a tradition in most cave tours. So if you go and take a cave tour, you always do lights out, because most of us have never seen total darkness before. If you go in your bedroom and turn out all the lights, you have lights coming in through the draperies, you got a little light coming under the doors, and if you let your eyes adjust long enough, they will actually adjust to that light and you'll be able to see stuff inside that room. Not so in caves. We're deep enough inside this cave that no light penetrates in here, so when we go lights out, your eyes will never adjust to it. You might hold an image of the light that you've been staring into or looking at or something that for a while, but basically after a while you will only see total darkness. So let's go lights out for about 10 seconds. What do you say? Ready? We invite schools to come to our parks for several reasons. One, we want to tell them about protecting the resource and how important it is to protect the resource for future generations. One of the things we do in this cave is point out to the fact that we're not just here for recreation today, we are here to preserve this for future generations. So if they show up at this cave in 50 years with their grandkids, they see exactly the same cave that we saw today. Come to the park, visit the park. It's very important that you visit these parks. That's why they were created for the American people, was to preserve little pieces of wilderness and places in America that was worth preserving, and help us preserve it so your kids can see what we've seen.